Hello and welcome. Welcome to the annual LGBT History Month lecture at Kellogg College. It is my great pleasure to invite you all here this afternoon. My name is Max Van Cleek. I'm Associate Professor of Human-Computer Interaction, Department of Computer Science. And I'm also the LGBT Fellow of Kellogg College. We're going to have our guest speaker present, and then afterwards we'll have more of an informal Q&A discussion and chat. Including discussion with some of our additional VIP guests in the audience. So if you do have questions, if you don't mind hanging on until that part of the talk, that would be lovely. Thank you. First things first, I'd like to thank our excellent Kellogg events team for organizing and making everything run beautifully smoothly, and to Kavi Guliani for making me organize, basically, and making this happen. I know this is the final day of LGBT History Month. Not that the cause and the talk will be any less interesting afterwards, but I think we can enjoy this as a good send-off to LGBT History Month this year. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I wanted to briefly remind ourselves what LGBT History Month is and what it represents. LGBT History Month is a month-long observation of the history and civil rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, as well as those of whose gender expressions and sexualities fall outside traditional norms. It is observed at least in 6 countries internationally. In the UK, LGBT History Month is celebrated each February, coinciding with the anniversary of the first attempt to repeal Section 28, the infamous series of laws across the UK that prohibited the, quote, promotion of homosexuality in schools from 1988 to the year 2000, and in recognition of the passing of the Employment Equality Regulations in 2003 that ensured the protection from discrimination in employment based upon sexual orientation. The month is intended as a means to raise awareness of and combat prejudice against the LGBT community while celebrating its achievements in diversity and making it more visible. This year, while celebrating these victories, including the improved visibility of LGBTQIA people, especially for trans, non-binary identities throughout society, we recognize that our community faces tremendous challenges. These include new waves of legislation in the US, in the UK, and beyond that threaten to undermine our fundamental freedoms and essential liberties needed for the welfare of our members. This includes new laws that, like Section 28, prohibit free speech and expression of LGBT-related issues in certain contexts, access to LGBT+ education in schools, equal opportunities of employment, as well as access to essential healthcare, especially for supporting trans and non-binary people. These laws, which represent huge steps back in civil rights for our community, are set alongside continued acts of physical and reputational violence against trans and non-binary people in particular, exacerbated and perpetuated through damaging rhetoric from far-right and, quote, gender-critical hate groups. It is for this purpose that we as a community must continue to protect and support it while we do everything we can to debunk, diffuse, and reflect the anger, hate, and misinformation about our community through reason, empathy, and understanding. It is in this setting that we're very welcome to invite somebody who has been at the front lines of this battle in supporting trans, non-binary, and LGBT+ youth in London for over 20 years. I believe that's right. Is it over 20 years? Nearly 20 years.
It's supposed to be. It's 18 years.
18 years specifically. Łukasz Konieczka was born in Sopot, Poland. I probably mispronounced that. And started his education at the College for Social Workers, where he graduated with a specialism in community development before continuing his education studying social psychology at SWPS University. Throughout his studies, Łukasz volunteered for Amnesty International as LGBT+ campaigns coordinator and Association Together Against AIDS as volunteers coordinator. Volunteering, however, in his words, butters no parsnips. So he had to work practically in a bank throughout his studies, and you should definitely ask him about that. So he decided to move to the UK and work as a social worker. That, however, proved to be difficult as his qualifications, though achieved with distinction, were not recognized in this country. He therefore worked in a nursing home in Farnborough as the head of activities before moving to London to work for Brent Youth Services as a Mosaic project manager. He took up any opportunity of learning offered by his employer and did qualifications in education management alongside youth work before he was made redundant and the project closed following government cuts. Łukasz, however, together with his colleagues, founded the charity Mosaic LGBT Youth Center that continued and expanded the work supporting, educating, and inspiring LGBT+ youth persons in order to shape a proud, strong, and cohesive LGBT+ community of the future. Mosaic was rebranded to the Mosaic LGBT+ Young Persons Trust in 2020. Mosaic LGBT+ Young Persons Trust today is an award-winning organization with a great array of services, and during the pandemic, diversified into online delivery with 24/7 opportunities, making sure that members were not left alone. Today, Łukasz is chair of the Greater London Youth Foundation and lectures at Imperial and Goldsmith, and volunteers as a home visitor for refugees at home. He's a committed advocate for equality and the equity for all, and has been a TEDx Soho speaker talking about belonging, and that YouTube link will be made available. We are extremely happy to have him as our 2023 LGBTQ+ History Month speaker. Please welcome Łukasz Konieczka.
Managing expectations. Just one beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone in between and beyond, because we're inclusive here. Ponad bada your doly old ear. That is not Polish, as you will come to know. It is a great privilege to speak down at you today, this LGBT+ History Month, making sure that we're addressing it and talking about our history and heritage. And I'm specifically going to be talking to you about the intergenerational element and where this wealth comes from. It is very interesting. When I was planning this talk and I was thinking about what to talk to you about, I had to start at the very beginning. And I thought I'll begin with my own very story. I had to like build a skeleton of somewhere. So I thought I'll talk about my own journey and how I have learned about the intergenerational wealth of our history. So let me start from the beginning. I have grown up in Poland, at the north in Sopot, as it was very well pronounced, if I may say so myself, which in all honesty couldn't be more idyllic, even if it's tried. We're talking beach, forest, lakes. That's where I grew up. That's the set. There was an air of Roman Catholic homophobia, of course, but I managed to convince myself, although magically, that that was just something that happened to people of sophisticated predisposition. And with that attitude, although delusional, it managed to kind of lead me through and survive a lot of the hostile attitudes of my peers. That has been present in my life kind of throughout until I arrived in London, and I think that allowed me to shield me away from a lot of those kind of very early experiences of hostility. Ignorance really is a bliss. I never learned much about LGBT+ history in Poland, and the things that have been passed down to me by previous generations were really not that much to write home about. I'll give you an example of a friend of mine who is now in his late 50s and runs a coffee shop in Gdynia, which is a city next door to mine. And he told me a very interesting time during the communist period in Poland when he was cruising in a park and a guy stole his wallet. Needless to say, the police was passing by, well, it was called militia, in fact, Polish communist police was called militia, was passing by. So he approached them and told them, this is what happened, my wallet has just been stolen. And they helped him. They took him on what is called kind of ride around. I don't know if you know what it is. It's kind of when you take the person who's a victim who has just reported a crime that just happened to travel across the neighborhood to try to spot the perpetrator in case they're like running or hiding. They were not successful. They did not find the person who did this. But needless to say, at the very same time, in the very same period in history, in this country, people were being harassed, beaten, and abused by the police. We're talking about the same period in history. So experience of Polish person who was just a victim of crime and their experience of police, somewhat completely different that the same person at the same time would have had in the UK. A lot of progress, as I was led to believe, was the UK. And needless to say, that some of you might have come across of Hyacinth. No, I'm not talking about keeping up appearances. I'm talking about an action present in communist Poland. Some of you might have seen the Netflix film. Some of you might have heard from Polish people and Polish activists talking about that specific action. It's very interesting because that action alone was a communist government's way of addressing the criminal activity that affected gay population. So the idea was quite good, right? They wanted to reduce the level of suffering within that community. The practice, however, didn't really match that idea because people who were delivering it on the ground were not trained in any specific way. They just went in and did what they were told to do, which they thought they were going to do. And it's very interesting because what we know from that period is that people were arrested, they were held for questioning, and they were very often asked to sign a statement. And the statement is very interesting, and that's the one I want to read to you. The statement that I'm talking about reads as follows, and it's a pre-printed statement that people had to sign. I am a homosexual and have sex with multiple partners, and hereby I confirm I am not attracted to minors. Let it sink in, right? We're talking 1987. This is when this action was taking place. The communist government was wise enough to differentiate between homosexuality and pedophilia. Yes, they were forcing people to sign those statements, of course, that's not great. And of course, it's a traumatic experience where people were stopped. But we need to remember one simple thing. At the very same time, in Ukraine, public press was talking about homosexuals as groomers. I was talking about the fact that we are here to corrupt children, right? A year later, after this action has finished, the books were closed, the files were never opened again. The government in Ukraine introduced Section 28 that you also were talking about. So if you think about it, Section 28, the very premise was we have to protect the mainstream society from homosexuals because they are here to obviously take over the universe and destroy it from within. So I think it's very interesting to have those parallels because when I came here, I kind of expected, I know what I expected, glitter on everyone understood corner, I think is kind of what the image was painted. But it is quite clear that this is not the story. So if you think about it, yes, was it stressful? Was this action by militia necessary? No. Was it affecting people? Yes. Was it traumatizing? Definitely. All those things are true, but those things lasted 1 year and no criminal prosecutions were ever brought against those individuals because criminal activity was never connected to homosexuality. Polish government has never passed a legislation that criminalized homosexuality. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because a lot of what we learn about British history is from criminal records. So we know that the police records, the court records are talking about homosexuality and inappropriate behavior and all those things that have happened and have been noted by the courts of the time or prosecutors of the time. In Poland, we don't have that because it has not really been a crime. Yes, there are some minuscule records of someone kind of being caught red-handed somewhere in the park, but it was not something that was being dealt with regularly. So moving swiftly on from kind of daily fail coverage and Section 28 and all the other things that were part of the kind of lived experience, we need to remember that in UK, you have the history of criminal prosecution that reaches 1533, right, with the of Henry VIII, which introduced the Banbury Act. Because he was allowed to have as much nookie as he wanted by homosexuals to that as well. So needless to say, I think we need to realize that that is, however, not within the intergenerational memory because 16th century is somewhat distant in the past. However, it has been passed through generations, I believe, in our kind of collective psyche. Church of England has recently in January apologized for the mistreatment of homosexuals. Still they introduced the same-sex marriage, but they apologized. So I suppose it's okay. Okay, forget it. It's fine. It's sorted. So I think that's something that we need to remember, because when I'm coming to this country and I kind of had to compare and contrast my own experiences in my own journey, I feel like I had to learn all those things, right, to function within this society. And it was quite interesting for me to do that. And I'm a migrant, as I mentioned, cursor please, those of you who were not listening earlier, or cannot spot my accent, as I am from abroad, coming here and taking the steps. I came to UK in 2005, and I started working in a nursing home, as it has been mentioned. I was the head of activities in a nursing home, looking after my residents. And it was a great job because it's very calm, very peaceful, very serene. But I remember a conversation that I have had with my resident, which was interesting to say the least. I asked her, having a classical conversation about a cup of tea, 6 o'clock a day, I suppose that was. I asked her, what did she do when she was younger for her job? And she said to me, well, I was a shop girl when I was younger, but I had to give it up when I was married. Sorry. What? And she said to me that she had to give up working because she was getting married to a man, admittedly, but getting married. And I just couldn't, like, so I called my grandmother immediately and I was like, is there a hole in my education that I was not aware of, big enough to drive a double-decker bus? That this is what has been happening in Poland as well, that you were supposed to be giving up your working when you're getting married. And my grandmother, without dropping a beat, said, darling, we were encouraged to work to build a socialist Poland. We didn't have time for all of that, giving up your job for what situation. And she was very, very clear that this was something very foreign to her as well. So thinking about the fact that I'm moving on to the supposedly progressive society, and I'm being told all those stories that are impacting, that have impacted people, and I'm having those conversations, and how, like, this is part of your living memory. Admittedly, Brenda, as her name was not at all a queer person. However, what we have to remember is that misogyny and sexism are very closely related and siblings to homophobia. Maybe because people think that homosexuals are somehow feminine and therefore somehow weaker. So what the little they know, do they? So I think it is quite important for us to remember that those things are coexistent. And when we are having those intergenerational conversations, we should discover that actually progress is not as distant as we might think. A lot of the suffering and a lot of the fight is still within the living memory. So needless to say, I think what is really important is for us to all remember that the journey traveled is within the living memory. So let's look at what happened next. When I moved on from that job, and when I got my job at Mosaic as a project manager for preventive services, was rightfully said, it was a very interesting moment in my life. I have experienced an imploding joy, thinking now I'm going to be able to be working, and they want to pay me as well to be working with Christmas. This is surreal, because there was no brochure on the career fair when I was younger. That was like, you can work with queers, you know, for your career. So I was very excited. I was very, very excited to work with young queers, up until the time when I realized that actually playing bingo with all the ladies with countless cups of tea is somewhat different to demands of adolescent youth. Of the queer predisposition. So that has been somewhat challenging. The adjustment and travel from working with lovely environment is calm and you just come in and say, hello, Brenda, how are you today? To having young person's demand thrown upon you is definitely something that needed some adjusting, I would say, in my own mindset. I have, however, felt a very strong sense of responsibility. I have had a strong sense of responsibility because I felt that I have to shape the building blocks of the community, right? So I marched into this job thinking very heavy responsibility that I now have to make sure that those young persons are equipped to be the community of the future that is better and wiser and prouder and stronger and more cohesive and all those things. And nobody ever tells you how to do that. I studied social work, they didn't tell me that. I studied community development, they don't tell you that. I studied social psychology, they didn't tell you that better. Not in youth work, not in education management, like nowhere they tell you how actually do you build a queer community. They tell you about community principles and all that stuff, but the queer element, you have to figure out yourself. And I felt that LGBT plus history is a key to that. And this is exactly why I insist for all the LGBT plus young persons whom we work with to visit places of interest to LGBT plus persons. We did LGBT plus history walk of Soho, where they saw all the different places which used to be frequented by queer people of the past. I insist for the young persons to go and pay their respects at the AIDS Memorial in Brighton whenever we are there. I have tried to find one in Oxford today to no avail. We wanted for the park for an hour, and we were failing in our attempt to find the memorial that was supposed to be there, to my pain. I think it's really important that we connect with our ancestors, that we connect with those stories and we connect with those narratives today, because those stories carry strength and they carry the power for us to formulate the community that we want to formulate. Remember that but let's think about the personal stories. My very first interaction in London, when I moved to London from Farnborough, with a person from our generation before me, was with one, name change for protection of innocent until obviously. So one was a nurse, a psychiatric nurse, who used to work for his whole career, Spanish origin. And we never really saw eye to eye. We kind of never really got on very well, unfortunately. And I never really knew why. It was a bit obtuse, a bit abrupt, and I kind of found it very difficult to find a common ground with him. But we saw each other very, very frequently because we had friends in common. We still do. And up until the point when I have managed to connect the dots, that he was a psychiatric nurse at the time when homosexuality was a psychiatric disorder. And I asked him a question. Have you ever administered treatment to gay people? And he said, yes, that's what we did back then. How could you do that, knowing who you are? And without any hesitation, with the most scary calmness, he says, that's the job. And I don't think I have recovered from that conversation very well. I don't think I'm still processing, because I cried that evening so much. It scares me that people can be so cruel towards each other, to fellow human, let alone the queer, but like the human being, and doing things that you know within yourself that are not okay to do. And we can only imagine the impact it might have had on all those individuals. I dread to think, and I don't even wish it upon him to have those considerations, because sleepless nights I had. And I think we need to remember the fact that that is within the living memory. If you think about it, 30 odd years ago, we would have been pathology. We would have been psychologically not well. It's not that long ago. And I know it feels like 30 odd years ago. Many of you would have not been a glimpse in the eye of your parents. However, I think it is what is quite important for us to remember, that it is within the living memory. People remember that. One remembers that. And living with that heaviness must be difficult, to say the least. I think it is quite critical for us all to hear those stories and have those conversations. But we're not really equipped to do that. We don't really reach out across the generations, if you think about it. I remember a situation where Ken, who was a chair of the board of trustees, came to the youth club once upon a time. And when he was asked how old he was, the young person, who shall remain anonymous for the purpose of this exercise, have responded that he's older than his grandfather, which then which then the young person had no self-reflection upon, and just carried on having a conversation. It's because we don't have the skill, you know, and I feel that to some extent it was a blessing that I worked in a nursing home before, because for me that was always quite natural, partially brought up by my grandparents. So for me, having conversation across generations, having friends like one, well, frenemies, like one kind of is not a difficult thing to do. I always have considered it as part of what we should be doing as a community, kind of standing closer together and having those conversations. I was, however, very young at the time when I had the conversation with one. I was very full of ideals and people should be, and they should be just so, people should be supportive and kind and nice and all those things. And needless to say, people don't always agree with that. And that is what's challenging. And I think through history, we can learn that those stories carry so much of our heritage and so much of our unity and solidarity. And through those stories, we can build the community of the future, because we cannot have a future if we don't have the past. Because our struggle today is not the first struggle. People have had those struggles before, and just knowing that is critical for your well-being. Because me knowing that I'm speaking here today as exciting, because we're not using the word stressful, we are using the word exciting, don't we? As exciting as it was, I had to remind myself repeatedly that this is something that people have done before. They survived, they're okay, you can do this as well. And that is reassuring. So if I can do this here, if you think about the building of the community, that surely is worth its weight in gold. So let me have a think about Ken again. Ken, back to you. So Ken was telling me a story, and it's not a secret, is it? Well, you don't know now. Too late now. Oops. I have silent stories. Ken was telling me a story about a time when one particular night he was out with his friends after a very busy week at work on a Friday night in Royal Vauxhall Tavern, only for it to be stormed by the police. This is within living memory. People have a memory of queer venues being invaded by the police. And just a few years ago, I was consulted by the Metropolitan Police on their strategy and how they should police the public sex environments, as they are referred to, because they want to be sensitive. And I'm like, is the progress linear? No, of course it's not. But you can see the difference between coming with the boots on into the queer venue without any invitation versus trying to consult to be more sensitive. Have things moved on? Some would argue they moved backwards. But there's this assumption that queer young persons today have got it easy. And that is another barrier for those conversations intergenerationally to happen. If we just assume that young LGBT+ persons have got it easy today, then we're assuming wrongly. Because if you think about it, yes, maybe they are not getting beaten up because they are queer by the police, but they're getting beaten up by the police because they are protesting to protect the planet, or they are protesting because they want to make sure that the trans people have got their rights. So there's other instructions that we know, and we know what the proposals of changing legislation mean for all those movements. So I think it is quite critical that we start thinking beyond the fact that LGBT+ persons say, oh, look at me. They don't know what bullying is. I can tell you they do. I have worked with young persons who are rejected from their faith groups, who've been rejected by their families, who have been made homeless. I have worked with young persons who have been in schools where teachers were the ones using the homophobic slurs. And no, I'm not talking 20 years ago. I'm talking now. It's really not as progressive and sorted as we'd like to think. Furthermore, we need to look at the fact that actually the LGBT+ community is not just one homonic group. What we need to start thinking about is the intersectionality within that group. And the fact that some communities within our community are struggling more than others. If you think about intersectional faith, if you think about intersectional different culture, I can tell you that among the times I had to have conversations with Polish parents who struggled with the LGBT plus identity of their child. Just because people arrive at the shore of Britain doesn't mean that they have left their bodies at home. They come in with full package, and those conversations have to carry on happening. So thinking that this is now all sorted because we have gay marriage, as it is sometimes quoted, is somewhat misleading and definitely not true. So that's the barrier for the young classes to interact and engage in intergenerational conversations. Every year, I work with Mark Healy, who has founded a charity, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's 172430. And it's an anti-hate crime charity to commemorate the nail bombing of Admiral Duncan in 1999. One of the 3 attacks that targeted the Asian community in Brick Lane and Black community in Brixton, alongside the gay community in Soho. Let it sink in, 1999. That literally just happened. Admittedly, maybe not for you, but it literally just happened. And I met people who were in that pub. I met people who were getting a coffee from the Algerian coffee shop just next door at the time when the bomb went off. They saw the police, the ambulance, the commotion. It is within the living memory that such a huge act of terror that horrified people at the time is within the living memory. Again, we need to focus on the fact it is still in the living memory. And it happened in such a supposedly progressive space. UK was supposed to be safe. When I learned about that, I could not compute because I have no point of reference to such a huge act of violence in Polish history. I don't have a point of reference. I just don't. I could not understand how anyone could explode anything. Admittedly, UK have had struggles with Iran and have had those cases before, but Poland didn't. So I came here thinking safe space, and this is what I'm learning. Again, within the living memory. And if you think about it in context of what I have just learned about communist rule back in the time at home, it's completely parallel. It's a completely different universe. We always have earthquake events. It's never been a problem. Versus in here, people 10 years were being invaded by the police. When I talk about this event, when I talk about the bombing of Admiral Duncan with my young cousins, they look at me as if I spoke of ancient Rome. I could have equally well just told them about ancient Greece or ancient Rome. This was 30 years, but that's before, like, they don't have a point of reference. And it's really difficult to bring those stories to life because they take reality as it is when they function in this reality, right? So when they're being born, they're kind of born into this society as it is now. So they're taking everything that the society offers without any kind of consideration that it might have been different or any different. If anything else, they aim for more and ask for more, which is great, and we love that. However, we need to remember that progress is not linear. And that progress is definitely not a one-way street. It's only when we start learning about all those things and all those struggles and all those things that we had to fight for, we learn to appreciate people on whose shoulders we are standing. We start to learn and appreciate the stories that made this community what it is today. So when people tell you things like, oh, LGBT doesn't define me, which FYI, pet peeve alert. Because nothing ever is going to, one thing doesn't ever define you. Me being Polish doesn't define me. Me being a man doesn't define me. Me being gay doesn't define, of course it doesn't, like one thing doesn't define you, but it's part of you. It's a part of, like, every element of your identity is part of you. Your ethnicity, your religion, your nationality, all those things make unique you. That is only for you to understand and for you to fight for things that are important to you. But we come together as a community for a reason. We come together because we know that this community is a space for us to find solace, understanding, support. And this is what I'm trying to install in my young persons when I work with them. And kind of bringing me back to Ken, I'm going to roll you out 15 times more. I've got you scheduled. Ken was telling me about one of the biggest protests against Section 28. And I always listen to those stories very carefully. I actually invited Ken several times to speak to my young persons, which they love every time, because it feels like a bit of a story time. So in 1988 was one of the biggest protests against Section 28. And that's fascinating because out of that movement, out of that protest, things like Stonewall, which is the UK's biggest campaigning charity, as well as Albert Kennedy Trust, also known as AKT, are what we hear and what we see today. This is what is so fascinating. And out of the struggle and fight, we can actually establish organizations that will serve generations to come and young people to come. And I think that is what builds us. And that was done in hand with Ian McCallum before he even became a household name. So, you know, some is just kind of look back and like, oh my God, it's just him standing next to another person, a friend, and we looked at the pictures. That was fascinating to look back in those days. But little did we know that trouble was brewing. Several years back, I have met Ash Kotak, a person who wouldn't mind me telling you that when he was diagnosed with HIV, there was no really treatment available. He got really unwell, very sick, but medication arrived just in time to save his life. Many others were not as lucky. We lost so many people to AIDS. And many people from that generation can remember a very horrifying social awareness campaign in the media. And those tombstones that are being carved out are still ingrained in people's minds. Admittedly, some people argue that it prevented the spread of AIDS maybe to even higher number of people because of the fear. But at what cost? It led us to a situation where people were rejected because of their HIV status. Doctors, nurses sometimes refused treatment to gay people in the wards. So families were getting rid of the people who they felt they might spread disease to the rest of the family. So they were feeling abandoned and left alone to fend for themselves. And the gay community couldn't help gay communities because gay communities was being affected and were scared themselves. So guess who came to the rescue? The lesbians and the trans folk came forward and looked after us when it wasn't glamorous, when it wasn't pretty. It wasn't covered in glitter and makeup and wigs and stilettos. When we were vulnerable, in need, thirsty. And this is the time when they actually materialized and helped and stepped up and looked after us and helped us through that very, very difficult time. And if you think about that period in history alone, that is not a story of loss. It's not a story of weakness. It's a story of power. It's a story of unity, of solidarity, of coming together. It is a story where we get to define our own power, and the power comes with community. When we come together and start looking after one another, we are the force to be reckoned with. It is when we are being divided, LGB versus T, the positive versus negative, those who have disease and those who don't. The division has never served us, in all honesty. We must make sure that when we are learning about the past, we are drawing conclusions for today. And I think that is really critical, because when we start looking at the generation that has lost their friends, their loved ones, their neighbors, the colleagues at work, this was a very scary time for people. And I think that is something that we need to remember when we are facing our own fears today. That those fears have been present in the past. We have experienced them. We thrived through them. And I think that is what is the message of the past, of the days gone by. So, and it's exactly why, as I mentioned, kind of circling back to the fact that we do need to go and pay our respects at the memorials. This is why Ashcroft is running a campaign to build an AIDS memorial in London, and has done so for the past decade, fighting mercilessly. And Raphael, who is here today, my alumnus, a young person who I'm very proud of and who is now an adult, has felt that and has built their website and make sure that they are able to reach out to more people, to make sure that they are able to function as an organization, as a charity, and establishing themselves. So proud to see people who I have worked with here today, and drawing from that learning and seeing that learning impacting today's decisions. We have to connect with our ancestors and cherish those who came through for us when we were not glamorous and glitter covered, but in need. Everyone here would have heard of Princess Diana. Everyone here would have heard of the situation where she has hugged a patient with AIDS. Such a simple act, but how impactful it was. How many minds have been made up about the fact that we are not to be in any way pitied or any way, form or shape of empathy with. So I think it is quite important that what we are doing when we are building this sense of community, that we are remembering those stories and that we are building on them. Many of you would have seen the film Pride, jumping ahead a bit. And it's a very interesting story, the story that I absolutely adore. And it's a very good tool to be used by young persons, because it tells us a different tale. It tells us a tale of the most unlikely of allieships. Lesbians and gays support the minors. That's before bisexuality is come up politically. All the trans people as well. Obviously we're there, just obviously we're in forefront as of yet. So don't get me started on it. Inclusion is very important in name, hence we use LGBT+ nowadays. But moving swiftly on, I think it's quite important that we recognize that that story carries a very interesting message of unity and reaching across the divide to the most unlikely ally, using the rule that enemy of my enemy must be my friend. And not coming with what you want from them, but what they might need from you. And that was a very interesting message of service and message of help and message of hope. Many of those places are still here, you know, Bits and Perverts, the event that happened in Camden Town, you can go and visit. The meetings were taking place very often in Gays the Word, and fundraising happened outside of the Gays the Word, which is the oldest UK LGBT+ bookshop. And you're very welcome to visit and support that living monument to our history, where all those conversations happened, if only those words could talk. It's fascinating just to hear and see that story. And every time I see an event, people show the film Pride. Like, look at this film Pride. We have so many stories like this that nobody wants to necessarily film or tell or share because they are not pretty or glamorous. So I think it's very important that we dive in and start having intergenerational conversations and use those individual stories of individual people who actually are able to tell us what really happened in their time. Anyways, moving swiftly on, we need to remember that trade unions from that film Pride were the ones who actually pushed for gay legislation, progressive gay legislation. Would we be where we are today without their support? I don't really know. I don't think perhaps not. It is, however, worth reminding ourselves that a lot of those activities are within the living memory still. We need to remember that all those events haven't happened a century ago. They are still within the living memory. You, my darlings, have had we have had our own language, and that's what I greeted you with at the beginning. It was called Polari, and it comes as a surprise to young persons when I tell them this for the very first time. They always look at me as if I am chatting something that I just invented. And it's always very interesting to tell them that we have had our own language, and that gay people have used it up until very late 60s, right? So just before 70s. So it's still in the living memory. People do remember it very, very well. And I think it's fascinating. I personally absolutely love the idea that we have had a language and we could communicate with each other without anyone else knowing that we are talking or who we're talking about. I think that's like ultimate sass, if you think about it. It's only Japanese can dream of, right? So nevertheless, that language was in use, and then in 1960s there was a radio show, Julian and Sandy, which kind of well, it was hilarious, and at least recorded the language for us for the future generations to peruse. However, made it somehow not really functional anymore, because everyone else was able to understand it, because it was present in BBC on wireless, which is not Wi-Fi, it's radio back in the day. So people were able to listen to it, and because they were exposed to the language and different words in different contexts, they were able to pick up the meaning. So no longer you could have a secret conversation, because guess what? Sharon was able to listen to it on the radio and was able to tell what you were gossiping all about and what you were all about. So that kind of made it redundant. Furthermore, in 1967, the legislation has changed, partially criminalizing homosexuality between males under the age of 21. And that's a very long disclosure if I haven't heard one. And many people think that this is when things started looking better for the queer community. But that's not true, unfortunately, because in 1967, yes, we lost the language. So it was no longer practical for us to use it. And because the legislation has changed, what it did do is that brought the conversation about homosexuality to the forefront, right? And there were so many restrictions on what is considered to be private space. Hotel room is not a private space, regardless of what you might be thinking. So you might think it's private space, allegedly not. So it was quite very closely defined what it actually meant private space. So actually prosecutions of homosexuals went up in that period, which is not something people often reflect upon. So when we thought we were having partial decriminalization of a party, what actually happened was that we have more people being prosecuted for homosexuality, right? So that is the step. Right? At the same time, we no longer have a language we can use, so we're kind of losing that kind of momentum and protection to some extent, and moving into very swiftly into the 70s. That is something that if we don't start learning about, if we don't explore the fact that we needed to have a separate language, we don't really know where it comes from, because it's partially Italian, partially Latin, partially German, and it's kind of trouble. So there's different schools of thought about where it kind of originates from. One thing we do know is that it came with sailors, so you can have your own guesses on why is that the case. But one thing that we are quite sure about is the fact that it has been used by our community, and I find it fascinating. We never had it in Poland. We had a very interesting form of Polish that was spoken in the queer community, and queer community would often use feminine descriptions of gender just for themselves as kind of like indicator that you are a gay person, but it was pretty much it. We didn't have a language, nothing as close to Polari. So when I first came and I learned that we had, I was just like, wow, this is the best thing since sliced bread. I was so excited that I just read everything I could find at the time, including I bought a dictionary of Polari on a book that was kind of very interesting for me to read through, and downloaded all the Julian and Sandy episodes I could find. And if you do get a moment, it is on YouTube if you were interested. So I do encourage you to do that. Yes, you do have homework after this, not in case you want. So we were discussing Hyacinth documentary, and now you are having Julian and Sandy on YouTube to be watching. So in case you thought this is it, you must come up and show up, and that'll be it. That's not the case. So I think it was quite important for us to realize that, right? If we think about the fact that the prosecutions went up, it wasn't until 2017 when people were actually pardoned for all those prosecutions for homosexuality. And 50,000 people were pardoned, which is, admittedly, I think it's kind of problematic, because we're pardoning people for something that you're saying, oh, doesn't matter. I mean, actually, it's not for you to pardon. I think it's for those people to pardon you, if anything. So I think that's quite problematic, that we're saying, oh, that's okay. like, it's fine. We don't mind it anymore. Because that's hugely problematic if you think about it, right? Why would you pardon someone for doing something that isn't wrong, right? So I think it's quite important for us to recognize. And that's the case. And it's only 2017. It like literally just happened. I know that I say that a lot, but it literally just happened. I'm sorry, but I'm just like, I just cannot understand how much change has happened in this recent period. And the question that I ask myself, and I think a lot of the times being asked in this field, and especially me as a pedagogue, ask myself of, do the borders really matter? Do the nationality really matter? In queer history, we talk a lot about Americanization of queer history. So we talk about Stonewall a lot, and Stonewall in. We're not talking about the charity, the Stonewall is the movement. And please, 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 Stonewall uprising, not a riot, pet peeve. I really do believe it was an uprising. It was led by persons of color, the drag queens and trans people. So let's just have that out of the way, right? It was not led by a white gay man, as some films would have you believe. So anyways, talking of cancelling culture, I definitely would cancel that film for sure. But moving to beyond. So I think it's quite important for us to recognize that, right? But if we think about the fact that the LGBT plus identity, in my view, is bigger than a nation. And I feel strongly connected to people who are experiencing oppression, no matter where they are in the world. I also feel very strongly connected with other people who are experiencing oppression. But I mean, if we focus on LGBT plus persons, and I can give you an example. I went on holidays to several years ago to Miami. Oh, a friend of mine, best friend of mine. And I said to him, like, I feel like I need to go to Orlando. I need to go to the site of the Pulse nightclub shooting. Because I feel like I need to pay my respects. And he's gay, but he did not feel the same at all. He was just like, oh, what? It's like 3 hours on a coach, and what do we have to? And it's the coach is at 5 a.m. in the morning, and it's a pain, and we're on holidays, we're supposed to be enjoying ourselves. I was like, I will not be able to enjoy myself knowing I haven't done this. And I did go, and it was very upsetting, and it definitely wasn't a thing to do on the holidays, on reflection. But would I have done again? Yes, because I feel like it's really important we need to connect with people who came before us. And those stories that are, even if they're on the other side of the pond, I mean, there's still stories of our struggle and oppression that happened to us. And for me, that brought to life the situation from 1999, when the animal dumping camp was bombed. It brought back those experiences to life, because it literally happened just now. We are not gone and done and dusted, and we can forget about it all. We are still struggling against oppression every single day. So sadly, what is the truth? Is that the history that we're making today is somehow misunderstood, in my view. Living memories of many teenagers are being dismissed and forgotten about, and there is that level of patronizing nod and a pat on the back saying, well, you know, you have your struggles, but, you know, in my day. And I think that we need to surpass that a bit. I think we need to bridge over that. And I wanted to reflect on something that is present in both generations, but is present completely differently. It's the word queer. The word queer itself is present in both generations at the same time today, but it has completely different meaning. Our young persons love it, embrace it, cherish it, overuse it. The older generations hate it, because very often that was the last thing they heard before they were being punched. So when we do intergenerational conversations, we need to make sure that this understanding is being built on both sides. Because what we have to remember is that that word has got two completely different realms at the very same period in time. But maybe that word is where we can begin. Because if it's present in both, maybe this is where we can start the conversation. Maybe this is the bridge that we all need to build understanding between the generations. Well, at least I hope it might be. So let me finish with a simple act that I want you all to join me with. I have been talking about intergenerational history. I have been talking about my own journey and kind of how I discovered those different histories and how I found it fascinating. And I hope that you will do your homework and do your own research and pick up a book or read or listen or simply talk to a person who lived through so much. So what I want you to do is to join me today, is standing up and giving a round of applause to all the people who came before us to build the community that we can enjoy today. I believe they deserve a round of applause. They would have not enjoyed the silence. Thank you.